Jason Arday was one of Cambridge's youngest black professors, appointed in 2023 and held up as living proof that elite institutions could finally change. 9 days after he resigned under a growing cloud of plagiarism and fabrication claims, he was found dead at his home in Battersea. Police say the death is unexpected but not suspicious. His family and supporters call it a result of media witch hunt. The real story is bigger than one man's tragedy. It is about what happens when universities prioritise the right identity over the right standard, and then act shocked when the foundations give up way. In 2023, Jason Arday was appointed Professor of Sociology of Education at Cambridge. At 37, he became the university's youngest black professor, and the appointment was celebrated as a historic breakthrough for diversity and representation. 3 years later, the same institution opened a formal investigation into his qualifications, honorary appointments, and academic record. He resigned the same day. 9 days later, after he was dead, this is not simply another story about online pylons or media access. It is a clear case study in how elite institutions lower their standards under political pressure, evaluate people on the basis of identity rather than rigorous evidence, and then struggle to contain the consequences when the cracks appear. Arday's rise is quite a personal story which was powerful and widely repeated. He came from a working class background with Ghanaian parents and spoke of several learning difficulties, claiming he had been mute until the age of 11 and functionally illiterate until 18. From there, he progressed to a PhD, a series of academic posts, and finally a Cambridge professor. Alongside the academic narrative, he was also presented as a prodigious charity fundraiser and endurance athlete, with claims of 30 marathons in 35 days, hundreds of miles on the treadmill, and millions of pounds raised for good causes. Cambridge hired him at the time when the university was under heavy political and cultural pressure to improve its diversity numbers at a senior level. Reporting has since suggested he was selected over more senior and more conventional qualified candidates. The appointment was treated as a success story for inclusion, while ordinary questions about the depth and consistency of his academic record were treated as a secondary or worse, as suspect. The problem began with a detailed textual comparison of his PhD thesis and published papers against earlier work by other academics. Multiple passages were identical or near identical, raising clear questions of plagiarism. At the same time, growing scrutiny fell on more extraordinary claims in his personal story. The extreme running feats, the fundraising totals, aspects of medical history, and some of the honorary positions listed on his CV. Cambridge initially defended him strongly, describing the criticism as a vile campaigning quote to undermine his credibility. Only when new information about his qualifications and appointments became impossible to ignore did the university open a formal investigation. Arday resigned the same day, stating the public scrutiny had become unbearable for him and his family. 9 days later, he was found dead. His family said a campaign of misinformation had been too much for him. Supporters, including senior public figures, have called a public inquiry into the media coverage, framing the entire episode as a witch hunt against a black academic who had been elevated as a symbol. There are two separate issues that need to be kept distinct. The first is individual. Serious allegations of plagiarism and fabrication were made, backed by detailed textual evidence. Those allegations deserve proper, transparent investigation rather than an automatic dismissal as racism or bad faith. The second issue is institutional. Cambridge, under sustained political and cultural pressure to diversify its senior ranks, evaluated someone whose record was not rigorously stress-tested against ordinary academic standards. When problems began to surface, the institutional instinct was to protect the narrative and the appointment rather than examine the evidence carefully. Only when the volume of questions became overwhelming did the university move to a formal process. This is the predictable result of treating academic appointments as a diversity metrics. When identity becomes a primary qualification, ordinary standards of evidence and the scrutiny are relaxed. The person placed in that position then carries an impossible burden. Every success is proof that the system is working, while every failure or question is treated as an attack on the entire project. When the house of cards starts to fall, the human cost is real, and the institutions that created the conditions still prefer to talk about witch hunts rather than their own hiring failures. So anyway guys, hopefully you've enjoyed this video about me talking about Jason Arday. And obviously Arday is another case of when academics are boosted through basically DEI meeting standards, and especially how politicized education has come, because especially when it comes down to DEI hiring, where they have the professors of certain ethnic backgrounds, including, for example, this is similar to what happened in America, where there was these professors, or I guess certain colleges or universities in America, where they would pretty much what they would do is hire people of certain backgrounds. Not just the anti-whiteness as well, because there were some other Asian students that weren't allowed to actually be accepted into the college because some of these colleges needed to meet their diversity standards. And you could say that these colleges were doing this to make sure people of colour could be represented more in media. But the problem with this is essentially when you go off by, in quote, merit, and you just hire people based off their race. And the problem with this is they're not, whether they are or not, have actually been stress tested, like what happened with Arday, is that some of these academics have been pushed just purely because of that. And this is actually costing people lives, not just also in the medical industry, with to do with some of these migrant nurses, for example, that might have come from Nigeria in the UK, which have more likely, for example, foreigners who come here to work are more likely, especially when they're nurses or doctors, being referred to as misconduct, whether that's on patients or within the workplace. And because of this, you see this in the education system, where these people are put to prompt. But the problem is, if they can't actually do their job, or they're an investigation for not actually being qualified to do the job, it gets too much pressure for them. And obviously someone like of Arday's background might have self-oofed himself because of all the pressure. And usually a white man, if he would probably just put his hands up and go, I'm sorry, I should have done this, and be investigated. Because keep in mind, when you're a professor, you are actually teaching people, and if you aren't qualified, you're going to misinform people just based on you doing all of these feats, saying that, I don't know, maybe you could be like someone like Kim Jong-un, and basically just make up a bunch of stuff about you having loads of medals, or loads of saying you have insane superpowers. And even if when you're an ethnic minority and you want to be shown a spotlight, it should be basically be able to do things what you are academically do, and not off the basis of your skin colour trying to be promoted. Like I said, with DEI, it's also affected the education system. And if you are educating people stuff, especially if they're training them to be a nurse or doctor, it's important you actually have the qualifications. And because of this DEI, it really makes all of these people put at risk of putting serious harm between the patients and also to do with the students. And you could say this is both, but obviously if you have a black professor who just happens to be black and he's actually qualified, maybe he could actually do his job. But again, like I said, because of DI and because of all this bogus immigration, and especially, maybe they have like India, where they have all these fake degrees, how it literally just painted by a painter, which is, imagine those people in the industry, it would be a complete and utter disaster, of which it has. And when it comes down to Arday, especially all these other academic frauds that say they're qualified, maybe like Robin DiAngelo, who writes a lot of anti-white work, and someone like that Malcolm X guy, not this one, the other one, who managed to actually create a lot of anti-white books in academia, probably if they were investigated, in my opinion, I think they wouldn't actually be qualified and probably end up becoming frauds. And all of the anti-white stuff has massive consequences. Again, I've made these points in before, but eventually you are probably going to see academics where you'll see people like Jason Arday, who was apparently a complete mute at a very young age, and as well couldn't read and write until he was 18, probably would be a massive red flag if he started saying he could do massive amounts of cardio, and especially he basically eventually got the last "we wuzzies" and say that we were professors and shit. But anyway, this is probably a strong lesson to people who pretend or LARP in academics, who are a minority, call anyone a racist or say it's a witch hunt, and then eventually get found out and then self-oof yourself. This is basically the consequences of which you have to watch out for. And as well, if you want to go in the link in the description below, links to my other channels and Discord as well.